Imagine you're hiking through a dense jungle somewhere in Central America. The trail disappears. You push through the overgrowth, machete in hand, sweating through your shirt, and then you stop dead. Because right there, half swallowed by roots and vines, is a stone wall. Carved. Massive. Definitely not natural. Your guide goes quiet. Not the nervous kind of quiet, the respectful kind. Because he knows something you don't. His grandmother used to bring offerings to this exact spot. His ancestors built it, and his bloodline never actually left. That moment, that collision between lost civilization and living descendant, happens more often than history books admit. We love the narrative of vanished peoples. It's dramatic. It sells museum tickets, but the truth is messier, stranger, and honestly more fascinating. Most extinct civilizations didn't disappear. They transformed, they scattered, they merged, and their descendants are still out there, farming, cooking, practicing old rituals, speaking ancient words, while the rest of the world scratches its head wondering where they went. So here are 12 ancient civilizations that supposedly vanished, and the very real, very alive people who carry their blood, their language, or their fire forward today. Starting with the civilization that practically invented the word mysterious, the Maya. Everyone knows the story. Towering pyramids. A calendar that made people think the world was ending in 2012. A civilization that supposedly collapsed around 900 AD and vanished into the jungle like smoke. Archaeologists call it the Terminal Classic Collapse. Dramatic name. Appropriately dramatic event. Cities were abandoned, trade routes broke down, populations plummeted in the southern lowlands. But here's the thing nobody puts in the headline. The Maya never actually disappeared. Right now, today, there are approximately 7 million Maya people living across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. 7 million. That is not a rounding error. That is a population larger than many European countries. The Quiche, the Yucatec Maya, the Tzotzil, the Kekchi, these are not historical footnotes. These are living communities with functioning languages, active cultural practices, and a very clear memory of who their ancestors were. The Maya didn't vanish. The cities did. There's a difference. What collapsed was the political structure, the divine kings, the monumental construction projects, the elaborate court culture. But the farmers, the weavers, the astronomers' grandchildren, they adapted, they moved, they survived Spanish colonization, forced labor, epidemic disease, and centuries of suppression, and they are still here, still speaking variations of the same language family their ancestors used to write in hieroglyphs on stone monuments. Some Maya communities in the highlands of Guatemala have maintained continuous agricultural practices for over 2,000 years on the same land. The milpa farming system, rotating crops of maize, beans, and squash, wasn't invented by some long-dead civilization. It's being practiced right now, this season, by people who can trace their ancestry directly to those pyramid builders. The Maya didn't collapse. They endured, and they'd really appreciate it if the documentaries stopped saying otherwise. Moving east and a few thousand years back, ancient Egypt. Few civilizations have been more thoroughly romanticized, excavated, and turned into Halloween costumes than ancient Egypt. The pharaohs, the pyramids, the elaborate death rituals, the cats, everyone's obsessed with ancient Egypt, and everyone assumes it ended somewhere around the time Alexander the Great showed up and Rome got involved. But Egypt's story is fascinatingly complicated. The Coptic Christians of Egypt are widely recognized as direct cultural and genetic descendants of the ancient Egyptians. Coptic, as a language, is literally the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, the same tongue spoken in the time of Ramesses II, filtered through Greek influence, preserved in liturgy. Coptic priests today are chanting in a direct linguistic descendant of the language that built the pyramids. Let that sink in for a moment. Genetic studies published in recent years have confirmed what Coptic communities maintained for centuries, that they carry significant ancient Egyptian ancestry, relatively unmixed compared to Yao. Other modern Egyptian populations who absorbed more Arab genetic influence after the Islamic conquest. The Copts never considered themselves survivors of something lost. To them, the line was never broken. They are Egypt, continuous, uninterrupted. And then there's the broader Egyptian population itself. Modern Egyptians are genetically and culturally a blend. Ancient Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Arab, Nubian, Ottoman, which is exactly what you'd expect from one of the world's great crossroads civilizations. The ancient Egyptians were never a sealed, static group. They were always absorbing and being absorbed. The civilization didn't die. It compounded. Now for a civilization that genuinely confuses scholars. The Indus Valley Civilization. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, cities with planned street grids, sophisticated drainage systems, and a writing system we still cannot read, were abandoned. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the most advanced urban cultures of the ancient world, seemingly evaporated. Seemed past tense. Important word. The leading hypothesis today is that climate change, specifically a prolonged drought, disrupted the monsoon patterns the civilization depended on for agriculture. The cities emptied not through conquest, but through necessity. People moved eastward toward the Ganges Plain, southward into the Indian subcontinent. Here's where it gets genuinely exciting. There is strong genetic and archaeological evidence that the descendants of the Indus Valley people are the ancestors of the Dravidian-speaking populations of South India. Groups like the Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam communities. Over 1 billion people in South Asia today carry some degree of Indus Valley ancestry. The language families diverged. The culture transformed beyond recognition. But the bloodline and certain deeply embedded cultural practices persisted. Certain symbols found on Indus Valley seals appear in folk traditions of South India today. The reverence for specific animals, certain ritual bathing practices, even proto-Shiva iconography. A seated figure in a yoga-like pose found on Indus seals has been linked by some researchers to later Hindu traditions. The thread is thin in places, yes, but it exists, and the people carrying it forward number in the hundreds of millions. The Minoans, Crete, the civilization that gave us the legend of the Minotaur, sprawling palace complexes at Knossos, and a writing system called Linear A that, like the Indus script, we still cannot fully decipher. The Minoans declined around 1450 BCE, some combination of volcanic catastrophe from the Thera eruption, Mycenaean invasion, and general Bronze Age chaos. Their palace culture collapsed, Linear A disappeared, their unique artistic style faded from the record. But the Minoans themselves, genetically, they didn't vanish into the Aegean Sea. A landmark genetic study analyzing ancient Minoan DNA found that they were most closely related to modern Cretans and other Greek populations. The people living on Crete today share a remarkable degree of ancestry with the Bronze Age palace builders who worshipped bull leaping and painted dolphins on their walls. The Mycenaean Greeks who overtook Minoan culture didn't erase the population, they absorbed it. The Minoan people became subsumed into a broader Aegean identity. Their genetics persisted, their artistic influence persisted, elements of Minoan design showing up in Mycenaean art, in early Greek religious practice, eventually threading into the broader tapestry of classical Greek civilization. Modern Cretans have a fierce regional identity and a cultural distinctiveness within Greece that some scholars argue carries echoes of that ancient pre-Greek heritage. Whether they'd identify themselves as Minoan descendants is another conversation, but the ancestry? It's there, preserved in the genome. The Nabataeans. Most people have heard of Petra, that stunning rose-red city carved directly into the cliffs of southern Jordan. All columned facades and narrow gorges called SIQs. Fewer people know anything about the people who built it. The Nabataeans were Arab traders who controlled the incense routes of the ancient world. Their kingdom peaked around the 1st century BCE, and they were absorbed into the Roman Empire in 106 AD. Roman culture washed over Petra. The trade routes shifted. The city slowly emptied. But the Nabataean people, the actual human beings who lived there, didn't dissolve. Modern genetic and historical research strongly suggests that the Bedouin tribes of Jordan, particularly those from the Petra region, are direct descendants of the Nabataeans. The Badul Bedouin, who lived inside the ancient ruins of Petra itself until relatively recently, maintained a presence in that carved sandstone city in an unbroken chain stretching back to antiquity. More critically, the Nabataean script didn't die. It evolved. Nabataean Aramaic, the writing system of those ancient traders, is the direct ancestor of the Arabic alphabet. Every time anyone writes in Arabic today, every text message in Cairo, every sign in Riyadh, every Quran ever written, they are using a writing system that grew directly from the Nabataean merchants of Petra. The civilization transformed completely, but it left its fingerprints on the written communication of over 2 billion people, the Khmer Empire, Angkor Wat, one of the most spectacular architectural achievements in human history. A temple complex so enormous that it took modern satellite imaging to fully map it. At its height, Angkor may have been the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, home to nearly 1 million people. By the 15th century, the empire had collapsed. Multiple invasions, ecological strain from deforestation and over-irrigation, and the shifting of trade routes toward maritime networks all contributed to Angkor's decline. The city was largely abandoned, swallowed by jungle, and rediscovered by European explorers in the 19th century with appropriate theatrics. Cambodians didn't find it dramatic at all, because they never forgot it was there. The Khmer people are the direct descendants of the Angkor Empire. Cambodia is essentially the remnant core of a once vast Khmer state. The Cambodian language today is descended from Old Khmer, the Theravada Buddhist practices interwoven with earlier Hindu traditions, visible everywhere in modern Cambodian religious life, reflect the syncretism of the Angkor Empire itself. Cambodian classical dance, recognized by UNESCO, maintains choreographic traditions stretching back centuries to the Apsara dancers carved in stone at Angkor Wat. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. When Cambodians look at Angkor Wat, they aren't looking at a mystery. They're looking at their grandparents' house, scaled up by a few orders of magnitude, with better stonework than most grandparents manage. The Axumite Empire. Few Western people could find Axum on a map, which is a real shame because it was one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Based in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, Axum was a major trade hub connecting the Roman Empire to India and Arabia. They minted their own coins. They invented a unique writing system. And according to Ethiopian tradition, a tradition they take very seriously, they were the guardians of the Ark of the Covenant. Whether or not you believe that last part, Axum's influence on the region was transformative. The empire converted to Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the earliest Christian states in world history. Then it declined, weakened by Islamic expansion that redirected Red Sea trade routes, and eventually faded from its political prominence. The survivors, the Tigrinya-speaking people of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, are direct descendants of the Aksumite population. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian institutions on the planet, traces its foundation directly to the Aksumite kingdom's conversion. The Ge'ez script, developed in ancient Axum, is still used liturgically in Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches today. Axum didn't collapse into oblivion. It became Ethiopia. The cultural transformation was enormous. The continuity underneath it was unbroken. The Etruscans, before Rome was Rome, before the Republic, before the legions, before the emperors, the Italian peninsula was home to a sophisticated civilization that the Romans both admired and borrowed from extensively. The Etruscans were skilled artists, engineers, and traders who had thriving city-states throughout central Italy. Rome absorbed Etruscan territory. The Etruscan language, unrelated to any other known language family, faded from use. By the 1st century BCE, Etruscan was effectively dead as a living tongue. The civilization was swallowed whole by Roman culture. Genetically, though, recent studies have produced fascinating findings. Ancient Etruscan DNA shows strong continuity with modern Tuscans. The people living in Tuscany today, eating their bistecca fiorentina and driving too fast on narrow roads, share measurable genetic ancestry with the ancient Etruscans. The Romans conquered Etruscan culture. They did not remove the people. Intermarriage, assimilation, and the slow grinding of Roman cultural dominance transformed everything about how these populations identified themselves. But the bloodlines remained. Certain Tuscan place names preserve Etruscan origins. Certain archaeological finds show continuity of religious practices from Etruscan into Roman periods. And some linguists argue that substratum influences of Etruscan persist faintly in the Italian spoken in certain parts of Tuscany. Ghost words from a language that supposedly died 2,000 years ago. The Scythians, masters of the Eurasian steppe, expert horsemen, legendary archers, and the owners of some of the most spectacular gold artwork ever produced by any ancient culture. The Scythians ranged across an enormous territory from the Black Sea to Central Asia, striking fear into settled civilizations and trading with everyone from the Greeks to the Persians. They didn't have cities. They didn't write things down. They were pastoral nomads who left their history in burial mounds, kurgans, packed with gold, weapons, and occasionally deeply disturbing evidence of human sacrifice. sacrifice. As sedentary empires expanded and other nomadic groups pushed in from the east, the Scythians gradually dissolved as a distinct cultural entity. But their descendants are walking around today. The Ancestral of the Caucasus, a small population in what is now Russia and Georgia, are widely accepted by historians and geneticists as the closest living relatives of the ancient Scythians. They speak an Iranian language directly descended from ancient Scythian. Their traditional folklore, epics, and cultural practices carry recognizable Scythian elements. Beyond the Ossetians, Scythian ancestry flows through many populations across the Eurasian steppe. The Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and other Central Asian groups carry partial Scythian heritage. The Scythians didn't disappear. They fractured, merged, and became the substrate underneath later Central Asian identities. The Nabataeans made the list for their alphabet. The Phoenicians deserved their own entry for essentially inventing the concept of alphabetic writing for the Western world. Based in what is now Lebanon and coastal Syria, the Phoenicians were the great maritime traders of the ancient Mediterranean. They established colonies as far as Carthage in North Africa and Cadiz in Spain. Their writing system, a consonantal alphabet with no vowels, was adapted by the Greeks, who added vowels, and that Greek adaptation became the Latin alphabet, which became every European writing system in existence. Phoenicia as a political entity ended with Alexander the Great and the subsequent Hellenization of the region. But the genetic evidence for Phoenician survival is remarkable. Studies analyzing ancient Phoenician DNA have found strong continuity with modern Lebanese populations. Lebanon has a genetic complexity that reflects thousands of years of trade and conquest: Canaanite, Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Arab. But the Phoenician substrate is measurably present. In Malta, where the Phoenicians established one of their early colonies, genetic traces of Phoenician ancestry persist in the modern population. And the Maltese language, while heavily influenced by Arabic, Italian, and other languages, has a Semitic base that traces back to the Phoenician Punic speech of ancient colonists. The Phoenicians gave the world its alphabet and then supposedly disappeared. In reality, they became everyone who uses that alphabet, which is most of the literate world. The Ancestral Puebloans, previously called the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning something roughly like ancient enemies, which should have been a hint that it wasn't the most respectful term. These were the people who built the extraordinary cliff dwellings of the American Southwest. Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Cliff Palace, sophisticated multi-story stone structures perched in canyon walls or arranged in massive planned complexes that aligned with astronomical events. Around 1300 AD, the major centers were abandoned. Drought, resource depletion, possibly social conflict. Multiple factors pushed the Ancestral Puebloans to disperse from their great communities. This abandonment was long treated by non-indigenous scholars as a mystery. Where did they go? What happened to them? The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona have been providing the answer for centuries, and they find the question mildly exhausting. The Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the various Rio Grande Pueblo communities are the direct descendants of the Ancestral Puebloans. They didn't vanish. They moved south and east, established new communities, and maintained cultural continuity across generations. Hopi oral traditions include detailed accounts of ancestral migrations, stories of clans traveling across the landscape, stopping at places to sign the rock with petroglyphs, and eventually gathering at the Hopi mesas in Arizona. These oral accounts correspond in fascinating ways with the archaeological evidence of migration routes and abandonment sequences. The Pueblo peoples have been particularly vocal about this. The mystery of ancestral Pueblo and disappearance is, from their perspective, a failure of listening. The answer was always there. Researchers just weren't asking the right people, the Sumerians, the civilization that, by most reckonings, started everything, or at least started the urban, literate, bureaucratic version of everything. Sumer in southern Mesopotamia produced the world's first writing system, the first law codes, the first epic literature, the first cities worthy of the name. Ur, Uruk, Eridu. These were places when most of the world was still scattered hamlets. Sumer was absorbed, first by the Akkadian Empire, then Babylonia, Assyria, Persia, and so forth. The Sumerian language died as a spoken tongue around 2000 BCE, preserved only as a liturgical and scholarly language for another 2,000 years. Much like Latin in medieval Europe, the political entity of Sumer vanished. The culture was layered over and over again. But the people, the agricultural communities of southern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, show remarkable genetic continuity going back to the earliest Neolithic farmers of the region. Modern Iraqis, particularly those from southern Iraq, carry substantial ancestry from these ancient populations. The Marsh Arabs, the Madan, who lived in the wetlands of southern Iraq for millennia in reed houses on floating islands, practiced ways of life strikingly similar to those depicted in ancient Sumerian art. Though their communities were devastated in the 20th century by deliberate drainage of the marshes, recovery efforts have restored some of these wetlands, and with them, echoes of a lifeway stretching back to the dawn of civilization. The Sumerians didn't go anywhere. They became everyone who came after them in the same river valley. Their mythology filtered into Babylonian religion, which influenced Hebrew tradition, which shaped Christianity and Islam. Their stories of a great flood appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh centuries before the Book of Genesis. The oldest stories in Western civilization have Sumerian fingerprints on them, and billions of people today are telling those stories in churches, in synagogues, in mosques, without the faintest idea that they're keeping a Sumerian tradition alive. Here's what ties all 12 of these civilizations together, and it's something that doesn't get said enough in history content. Civilizations don't disappear, they transform. The idea of a civilization vanishing is almost always a narrative convenience. It's a story structure that satisfies a particular human appetite for mystery and tragedy. The lost city, the dead people, the unanswerable riddle. It's atmospheric, it's cinematic, but it's almost never accurate. What actually happens is far more interesting. A political system collapses under pressure. Drought, invasion, economic failure, internal conflict. The monumental architecture stops being maintained. The writing system stops being taught. The particular elite culture that produced the fancy objects archaeologists love to find, that goes away. And because archaeology has historically been better at finding fancy objects than understanding ordinary people, we interpret the absence of elite culture as the absence of people entirely. But the farmers are still farming. The weavers are still weaving. The mothers are still telling their children the old stories in slightly modified forms, in slightly different dialects. The bloodline continues. The fire doesn't go out. It just moves to a smaller hearth. The Maya farming families who watched Tikal get overgrown with jungle didn't experience a collapse. They experienced a political restructuring and possibly a relief from the brutal labor demands of pyramid construction. Their lives changed. They didn't end. The ancestral Puebloan communities who left Chaco Canyon didn't walk off the edge of the earth. They walked south. They built new homes. They kept their ceremonies, their pottery traditions, their cosmological systems, and their descendants today will tell you exactly this, if you ask. There's something important in recognizing that the 7 million Maya people alive today are not related to the ancient Maya in some distant, metaphorical sense. They are the ancient Maya, continued, evolved, adapted, the same way that you are in a meaningful biological sense, continuous with your great-great-great-grandmother, even if you dress differently and have opinions about streaming services that she couldn't have imagined. The vanished civilization narrative also has a darker edge worth examining. It has sometimes been used, consciously or not, to suggest that the descendants of these civilizations have no claim to their ancestral sites, artifacts, or lands. If the Maya disappeared, then who are these people asking for the return of sacred objects from museum collections? If the ancestral Puebloans vanished, why should Pueblo communities have input on archaeological excavations of their ancestors' homes? The answer is obvious once you stop treating history as a series of disappearances and start treating it as a continuous story with living characters still in the cast. The stone cities crumble, the writing systems get lost, the political structures collapse under their own weight or under someone else's army. But the people, adaptable, persistent, stubbornly alive, keep going. They remember, even when the records don't. They carry the past in their languages, their ceremonies, their faces, their DNA, their stories told by firelight to children who will tell them again. Every civilization on this list was pronounced dead by someone, somewhere, at some point. Every single one of them had representatives who would have found that pronouncement deeply rude. Because here's the truth that a hike through a Central American jungle can teach you faster than any textbook: the lost civilization isn't lost. It's standing right next to you, watching you fail to recognize it, probably a little amused, and absolutely still here.